I'm now starting a recording. So our first presentation of the morning, of the afternoon rather, will be from Rose Swift. Rose is a research ecologist currently with the Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Station, and she'll be talking about seasonal survival and reversible state effects in two migratory shorebirds. So Rose, thank you for being with us today, and take it away.
Thank you for having me here today. I'm actually really excited to tell you guys about two different stories today. So I'm going to talk about how we can talk or connect information on migratory connectivity and get those really important seasonal vital rate information we're talking so much about today for two different linked populations of shorebirds. So I'm first going to talk about the Hudsonian godwit, which was the focus of my dissertation work at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and Cornell University, and then tell you a bit about some work I've been collaborating on at USGS on the piping plover. So getting into the first of these two stories on the Hudsonian godwit, in case you're not familiar, they are considered an extreme long-distance migratory shorebird. They breed in the Arctic and subarctic and overwinter in the southern cone of South America. And despite rapid declines, they are considered a species of conservation concern and don't have any formal listing criteria currently. And they do also have relatively high migratory connectivity based on some geolocator and satellite tag work. We know that those three main breeding areas you can see in the map in green mostly only use one of the three non-breeding areas shown in blue in southern South America. And today I'm going to talk to you only about one of these three breeding populations that breeds in south central Alaska and overwinters in south central Chile. And what we know about this population clearly won't necessarily hold true for the rest of the species, much like what Viviana was talking about earlier. We need to understand not only these population-specific estimates, but also range-wide when that's possible. So one of our first questions that we wanted to tackle was trying to understand if migration was actually taxing, in particular for this species. We often think that migration might be a limiting factor for species, and we thought this would likely be true for this species that undertakes the second longest nonstop recorded flight during northbound migration. And we decided to address this by first estimating period-specific seasonal survival. We did this trying to take advantage of data that we knew to be available to us. So we utilized individuals that had been marked as part of Nathan Center and my own PhD work from Beluga River, Alaska, and collaborated with some folks from the US Fish and Wildlife Service that had been banding birds on the non-breeding grounds. And with these two distinct marked groups of birds that represent a single breeding population, we're able to estimate seasonal survival. So we did this by first assigning each of the week of the annual cycle of a year into one of the four periods that we were interested in. And we did this taking advantage of the wealth of information that was present on migratory timing from Nathan Center's geolocator study. And once we had assigned that, we were able to then calculate our survival estimates. So we calculated annual survival for each of the two marked populations and the appropriate within season survival estimate for each one, and did some not so complex algebra, actually, in order to estimate a single migration season weekly survival estimate. We were unfortunately unable to differentiate between north and southbound migration with this particular data set. And when that's all said and done, we get our weekly estimates of survival, which we found to be much higher during the stationary non-breeding season than throughout the rest of the annual cycle. But we were particularly interested in understanding period survival, and since each period is of unequal length, we just scale those weekly estimates up based on the lengths that we had already determined. When we do that, we find that the non-breeding season still has really high annual or period survival, much higher than breeding season survival. And when we compare the two migration periods, we see that northbound migration, because of its much shorter length as individuals undertake a series of nonstop flights with very short stopovers, has higher period survival than the more protracted southbound migration. And while these period-specific seasonal survival estimates provide a wealth of information that can eventually, hopefully, be used in a population model, they don't tell us a lot about how these different periods might interact. And so we explored this using partial least squares path modeling, taking advantage of our linked population where we have observations of individuals from both the non-breeding season in southern Chile, as well as during the breeding season in Alaska. And using those observations of individuals, we did document a positive reversible state effect. So individuals that overwintered in higher quality habitats in the non-breeding season and that were improved body condition during the non-breeding season had higher return rates to the breeding grounds and had improved nest and chick survival. And those three metrics combined to form that breeding performance composite metric you see on the screen. And so unsurprisingly, for a large-bodied, presumably long-lived species, we found high annual survival for the species and high survival throughout the annual cycle. But it was highest during the stationary non-breeding season, which and potentially lowest during the breeding season, which suggests that migration is likely not the most taxing part of the migratory annual cycle for the species. And there's some growing body of literature that is collaborating this for other species as well. And it also appears as though the breeding season and southbound migration likely are some of the parts of the annual cycle where we lose most of our individuals based on the lower period survival that we see there. And we don't know exactly what might be going on in southbound migration. We think that breeding season low survival estimate is likely due to both the high energetic demands of breeding and the combination with high predation risk for those individuals during incubation and brood rearing. And there's some really interesting stories coming out about that, some work that Nathan Center's lab is currently doing that I don't have time to talk about here today. And we also documented this positive reversible state effect of an individual's non-breeding season body condition on both their survival or return rates and their future breeding performance. And we documented this during a period of time in which this particular breeding population was undergoing declines in annual survival, which suggests that conditions on the non-breeding grounds can likely affect population dynamics across the annual cycle. And so we concluded that the non-breeding season is this critical period for Hudsonian gobrets that breed in Alaska, as it allows individuals to both dissipate costs from delays in migratory timing, which was part of Nate Center's PhD work, but also allows them to fuel and prepare for future stages of the annual cycle. And this can have potentially cascading effects for the population if conditions in these areas become degraded. One of the things that Nathan Center is planning to follow up on this with, so stay tuned later for a few years, is to try to understand how to connect these reversible state effects that are occurring at the individual level to see how they might be directly influencing trends in population size. So this story isn't completed yet, but is well on the way to understanding some of what might be limiting this particular breeding population. Though it does not appear to be true for the rest of the species, there's some evidence that the birds that breed in Churchill are likely more limited by fecundity than by individual condition or annual survival, or the conditions in the non-breeding season that seem to be more relevant for this breeding population. So the time that I've left, I want to really quickly tell you about piping plover's story, which is similar, but also very different. And piping plovers are a much smaller species, and they only undertake a short distance migrant. They stay in North America year round, which makes this particularly easy to get information about individuals throughout the year. This species in North America has been federally protected. In the US, they've been protected since the 1980s, so there's a large recovery effort for this species. And because they stay in North America, we believe, based on observations of individuals, that they have relatively low migratory connectivity. And this work is really spearheaded by my colleague here at Northern Prairie, Kristen Ellis, but also was a large collaborative effort of individuals and institutions that gave us data in order to look at a longer time span and across the entire Great Plains and Great Lakes populations of piping plovers. And we are interested in simultaneously estimating migratory connectivity as well as seasonal survival and the drivers behind that. And so we used a geographic multi-state model with seasonal time steps and observations of those individuals throughout the year. We found that survival was high during the breeding season compared to the rest of the year. So those three estimates below encompass both migration periods as well as the non-breeding season. But happily, for a listed species, we found that survival was relatively stable over time, and this was particularly true for those breeding season estimates. There was much more variability in the non-breeding or winter season estimates, And so we wanted to understand what might be driving that. And we looked at harmful algal blooms, hurricanes, and oil spills, and found that winter season survival was negatively related to both harmful algal blooms and hurricanes, but not oil spills. But what was really interesting was there was actually a carryover effect for those harmful algal blooms, negatively affecting survival in the summer after they were encountered, suggesting residual toxicity throughout the year for that species. When we look at migratory connectivity, we found that the Great Plains population, which is represented by the first three states on the x-axis, Northern Great Plains, Southern Great Plains, and Prairie Canada, diverged from the Great Lakes breeding birds. They were more likely to overwinter in Texas or Mexico Gulf Coast versus the Atlantic coastline. So overall, we found for piping plovers that hurricanes and harmful algal blooms may actually limit recovery efforts for piping plovers, which is particularly interesting based on the sheer amount of effort that's been going on to protect them on their breeding grounds for many years. We also found that harmful algal blooms may have negative carryover effects during the breeding season that would be really interesting to understand how this residual toxicity might be interacting for individuals throughout the year. And while we did find moderate to low levels of connectivity, which is a good sign to help buffer piping plovers against extreme events, it does seem that if extreme events occur on the Atlantic coastline, that the Great Lakes population will be disproportionately affected compared to the Great Plains population. So these two studies had very different objectives, different questions, and different approaches in order to integrate information on migratory connectivity and seasonal survival, but they both provide a lot of insights on what we can do when we do have linked populations. These studies took advantage of really old school, alphanumeric engraved flag flags in order to get resites of individuals throughout the year without necessarily needing some of the technology or the other avenues of collecting some of this information that we've been talking about earlier today. And they both found that the non-breeding season was really important for those species, but for very different reasons. For the Hudsonian godwit, it was allowing individuals to maintain their migration strategy and to fuel themselves in order to improve their reproductive performance as well as their survival throughout the year. Whereas for piping plovers, it seems like factors that are occurring during this stage of the annual cycle might actually be limiting the population, though it's going to be currently very difficult to manage for some of those factors like hurricanes. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions you have on either of those two studies.
Great. Thank you so much, Rose. That was really a great way to show the difference between those two species and to summarize those results. Really well done. And we do have time for a few questions. So, Anna, how do things look on the Q&A?
Good. We do have a question in the Q&A. So someone is wondering, what specifically are these harmful algal blooms? Is it a red tide in Florida or something else?
Yeah, so it's the main species that occurs in red tides. I forget what the species name is. I can look that up and get that back to you. But it's looking at the intensity of those events, and they can occur both in Florida, where a lot of them occur, but also throughout the non-breeding range for piping plovers.
Cool. So there are no other questions right now in the Q&A. I have a question for you though, Rose. So it's really cool, like for Hudsonian godwit, especially that you have these differential survival rates at different parts of the annual cycle, and you kind of have an understanding of like some of the factors on the non-breeding grounds that are having these carryover effects. And you mentioned that Nate Center is doing some follow-up work to like try to scale up to like the overall population. What do you see as like other next steps to really like pinpointing specific causes of decline or limiting parts of the year, and to the point where you can start to manage the population?
Yeah, I mean, we know a lot about the species, but we also don't know a lot. We know very little about what's going on during either migration period, so focusing on those could provide some insights as well. And we don't actually know what might be driving survival differences between those periods. So that would be really one of the next critical steps in order to try to have some more concrete conservation or management implications for the species. If we know why we see these differential survival rates, we might be able to do something about them.
Ken?
Yeah, just a real quick question. If I interpreted correctly, so they do these incredible overwater flights in the spring, yet you found essentially that they had higher survival during that spring migration period. So any thoughts on that? Is that big overwater flight actually an adaptation for just getting there so quickly that they don't have many risks? Or
Yeah, those nonstop flights for northbound migration certainly are getting them there very quickly. It's a really tight migratory timing schedule for the breeding season, so that is important for that. But we really think that, you know, they're just adapted for this migration strategy, and those individuals that can undertake this migration strategy do so successfully year after year. And we likely are losing a lot of individuals that aren't high enough quality or whatever it is when they first try to undertake that first southbound migration. So having age-specific rates would be really important too.
thanks.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, Rose. We'll move from shorebird to grassland birds next. And Mo Carell and Adam Green will be talking about developing an integrated population model for the Baird sparrow. And I hear on the grapevine that we're pretty close to really understanding a lot of stuff about Baird sparrow. Fill us in. Mo is research director at the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, and Adam Green did most of his work there, but now works for the Bureau of Land Management and is stationed in Denver. So thanks very much for contributing your insights, and take it away, Mo.
Awesome, thanks, Tom. Yeah, so thanks for the opportunity to present. We are kind of in the beginning of the end stage to developing an integrated population model for the Baird sparrow. So we'll be sharing some of our, challenges and victories that we've run into along the way. If I can get it to advance. There we go. And just a little bit about Bird Conservancy before we get started. Bird Conservancy is based in Brighton and Fort Collins, Colorado, and we have a general mission of connecting birds, people, and land through science, education, and stewardship. And again, last thing before we start is just a shout out to our partners and funders. This integrated population model is a product of work that started really in 2012 and has been supported by a real diverse set of partners and stakeholders and funders, people that supported us on the ground getting up and running, and those funders that supported analysis, which isn't always the sexiest thing to support. So thank you for all the support going forward. So generally speaking, and I'm sure this isn't a surprise to many of you, is grassland birds are in steep decline. This is one of the take-homes that came out of the 3 Billion Birds paper, and roughly 53% of grassland birds have been lost since 1970. Grassland birds in North America congregate in 2 specific geographies during the breeding and non-breeding seasons. So as you can see on these heat maps during the breeding season, they really congregate in the northern Great Plains of Canada and the US. And then on the wintering grounds, they congregate mostly in the Chihuahuan Desert of southwestern US and Mexico. And the Baird sparrow, as far as where it maintains its range, is really kind of an exemplary grassland bird in that regard. They breed almost exclusively in the northern Great Plains, although we've fairly recently found evidence of them breeding elsewhere in Colorado, actually. But for the most part, they are breeding in the northern Great Plains and then migrate down to the Chihuahuan Desert of Mexico and southwestern US during the wintertime. They're also identified as a 3X species by the R2R effort. So we know that this bird is in decline. Roughly 2% annual decline is what we're seeing for this species. But breeding abundance, really, if we think back to our Ecology 101 lessons, abundance or the population in general is a factor of the population from the previous year, plus births, minus deaths, plus immigration, minus emigration. And so if we take that lesson that we probably all learned back in undergrad and apply it to this system, this really comes out as breeding abundance being a product of seasonal vital rates that are occurring across the full annual cycle for the Baird sparrow. And unfortunately, to make things more complicated, habitat can drive differences in these seasonal vital rates and sometimes drive them differently, depending on the seasonal vital rate we're talking about. Generally speaking, grassland birds are in decline and driven by conversion cropland ag of grasslands, climate change, and mismanaged grazing and shrub encroachment on those grasslands, specifically on the wintering grounds. So developing an integrated population model will help us connect these data of seasonal vital rates across the full annual cycle. So we set out to directly measure those rates, and this was no small feat. We had 2 sites in the breeding season and 4 sites in the non-breeding season. The data collection for our breeding season work, was headed up by J.C. Bernath Plaisted, who was formerly with Bird Conservancy as an avian ecologist, but is now at the University of Wisconsin-Madison working on his PhD. All of our data collection on the wintering grounds was headed up by Aaron Strasser, who is an avian ecologist with Bird Conservancy, has been working down on the wintering grounds since 2012. So at our breeding ground sites, we collected a lot of demographic information. Nest search and monitoring data was something that we collected every year from 2015 to 2018. We used both opportunistic and standardized nest search methods, and then monitored these nests every 3 days till fledge or fail. We also collected or captured adults on the breeding and wintering grounds, and we used slightly different methodologies to catch these birds. On the breeding grounds, we used targeted playback using conspecific playback, and we only tagged males. And that was because we found from an early pilot study that tagging females could cause nest abandonment, so we didn't want to do that. But on the wintering grounds, we used a slightly different method of corralling birds into standing mist net arrays using large groups of humans. And in that case, we banded both males and females. And to just relate back to what Kristen was saying yesterday, we do have feathers from these captures. And I know she's aware of that, but I'm really excited about the opportunity to collaborate based on what she was talking about yesterday. So once we captured these birds, we deployed VHF radio transmitters on both adults and also juveniles from the nests that we found. And then we tracked them daily to look at their locations and also record habitat information where we found those birds. And so just like that, we collected demographic information that helped us estimate breeding adult survival, reproductive success or fecundity, juvenile survival, and winter survival. And you can see our sample numbers underneath those vital rates. And thinking back to our Ecology 101 lesson, we're really getting a large part of the way towards filling this equation. However, we are still in lack of breeding abundance from where to start. So to get population data and to incorporate that population data into the IPM, we use the integrated monitoring of bird conservation regions survey data set that spans much of the Great Plains and Intermountain West. And with that, I will hand it over to Adam Green to go through the Greek with you.
All right, thanks, Mo. So to kind of keep with that population equation that Mo laid out, we can break that down even further to include our demographic data, which is shown, the data that we have is shown in red. So like N is population abundance from the IMBCR data. We have breeding survival, nest survival, fecundity, and juvenile survival and winter survival, leaving only the parameters apparent survival and immigration during the migratory periods. All right, next slide. So we developed an integrated population model within a Bayesian framework, and the model essentially projects the population from one time period to the next using that equation. And like the initial abundance from the IMBCR data and the demographic rates, and then any discrepancies between the projection of the population and the estimated abundance from the next time step in the IMBCR data help to inform the unmeasured migratory parameters. So after fitting the model, we performed a sensitivity analysis to better understand which factors were influencing population change. And with that analysis, we projected population change using the mean demographic rates. And then we varied each rate by just a little bit, one by one, and compared the differences in the population growth to the growth estimated using only the means. All right, next. So in addition to getting estimates for the migratory periods, we also wanted to know which variables were driving changes in the population. So we included environmental and management covariates on most of the parameters to assess these relationships. So these included things like climate variables, such as precipitation during May and June on the breeding parameters, land cover, like the amount of grasslands and road density, vegetation condition, which we used NDVI to represent, which measures the greenness of the vegetation, and some management practices such as the Conservation Reserve Program, which is a government incentive program to return marginal cropland to grass cover on the breeding grounds, as well as ejidos, which are communal grazing plots in Mexico on the wintering grounds. Next. So just some basic results. The covariate relation, this shows the covariate relationships with each of the demographic rates. So the demographic rates are in each of the colors. You can see on the top, the effect sizes on the left, and these are all on the y-axis, and these are all standardized with a mean of 0, so they're comparable. And then each covariate on the y-axis or the x-axis, so temperature, precipitation, quadratic effects of temperature, and so on. And you hit the next slide, Mo. And so we didn't have a ton of significant relationships, but juvenile survival increased as chicks got older. Immigration into a breeding site was negatively related to NDVI, the greenness, and positively related to the amount of CRP on the landscape. And then winter survival had a quadratic effect of the day of season. So there was maximum winter survival kind of in the middle of the winter. And so this slide shows some of the results of the sensitivity analysis. So sensitivity is on the y-axis, and that is the difference in the population growth per unit change of each of those demographic rates. So on the x-axis, we have each of the demographic parameters. And you can see that changing immigration has the largest influence on population growth. And then we can zoom in, and that's followed by winter survival, nest survival, juvenile survival, breeding survival, and apparent migration survival, and then finally fecundity. So those other ones are fairly similar. But we also wanted to look at the influence of each of the covariates on population growth, because covariates can influence multiple demographic rates. And so we took the same approach and varied each of the covariate values by just a little bit and calculated sensitivity again. And so you can see here that, I think we need to go to the next slide. Yep. Winter precipitation had the most influence on population growth, which unfortunately we can't really change very easily, at least without some large policy changes. But the next most influential covariate was the amount of CRP on the breeding grounds. So that's something we can actually change and potentially influence paired spread populations. And then finally, some climate variables kind of came in a close third. So some of you might be interested in some of the challenges we faced so far. There are a few minor ones, including finding comparable GIS layers to cover the whole study area. So we couldn't find one GIS layer that was kind of the same across all three countries, the US, Canada, and Mexico. So we kind of had to use different ones that roughly measured the same thing in each country. So some of the interpretation of those covariates may differ slightly between the countries. So the breeding and the wintering, especially. Complete data sets across the entire range are difficult to obtain. So obviously this is a lot of work as it is, but we still only had a handful of demographic sites. Sorry for children in the background. And so we might not have very completely representative estimates of some of the demographic rates. And then again, IMBCR only covers the US portion of the breeding range. We hope to incorporate breeding bird survey data to cover a large portion of Baird sparrow breeding range, but that's a large, significant analytical undertaking. We also wanted to include enough complexity for realism while also being able to estimate parameters given the information we have. So for example, it'd be nice to separate fall and spring migration, but without incorporating winter abundance data or migration demographic information, we can't do that currently. But our biggest challenge was the strong influence of the abundance data on the demographic data once we integrated everything. Go. And even got a whole slide for this. So using only the demographic data, we could get certain estimates of, or we could get estimates of those and the covariate relationships. And we expected any discrepancies between that projected abundance that I talked about earlier, given those demographic rates, and the observed abundance would go into estimating and informing the migratory demographic rate, so parent survival and immigration. But we have 12 years and thousands of point counts in the IMBCR data set. So instead, the demographic rates where we have the data were strongly influenced by the abundance data. So for example, winter survival went from about 5 to 10% using only the demographic data, that estimate, to around 90% when we integrated the data. So obviously this influences not only the kind of average estimates, but also the covariate relationships as well. So our current, though not ideal solution, is to use a random subset of the abundance data. And currently we're using about 15% of the IMBCR data. And we plan to increase that proportion to the full data set that we're using to see kind of where things start to break down. So with that, I will hand it back over to Mo.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Adam. So just to go back to our take-home messages, this is certainly still preliminary, but the influence of both climate and the Conservation Reserve Program on the Baird sparrow population trajectory were really compelling. So winter precipitation is the most influential covariate on Baird sparrow population trajectory. And so while Adam mentioned this before, it's not directly affected by management on the ground. It's good to know that winter precip and what's going on during the wintering season is important to this species going forward. The big thing that I find pretty exciting about these results is that the amount of lands enrolled in Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, on the breeding grounds was also very influential and can be directly affected by conservation dollars. So, you know, in an ideal world where we can throw more dollars either at the CRP program as far as enrollment goes, or getting people on the ground to help landowners understand and enroll in CRP, both could be ways to directly help the Baird sparrow population into the future. So with that, we still have work to do. We need to work to incorporate our land cover data, specifically the amount of grasslands right around the points that we're estimating populations at will be important to incorporate for our final model. Adam mentioned this, but we also hope to bring in breeding bird survey data to more fully represent the population across its entire breeding season range. And then we also want to project across a series of specific conservation scenarios and timelines, so we really get at the identification for efficient use of conservation dollars to mitigate the Baird sparrow decline. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you to, again, to our partners and funders, and also to our diligent team of field technicians that helped us collect all of this data. Thank you very much. And if we don't have time now for questions, I think we have time at the end of the session.
Thanks so much. That's a great example of a model species and a model process that's gone from, you know, runs the gamut. And thanks so much for the ideas of what to do next. And you're right, we don't have time for questions. We'll want to move forward, but we will have an opportunity to come back to this certainly during the panel discussion. So thanks again, Mo. And we'll move on to Clark Rushing now, who is currently an assistant professor at Utah State University as a population ecologist who's studying quantifying demographic processes and how that influences individuals, populations, and species. And so Clark, what do we know about wood thrush?
Yeah, I'm going to try to summarize that today. So I'm going to talk about work that's been done to try to understand what's causing the declines of wood thrush and what's limiting wood thrush populations. I'll just preface that some of this work I've been involved with and know quite well. Some of it is work that I wasn't involved with and that I'll try to summarize, but to try to look at how these different studies that have been done tell us cumulatively what might be happening to wood thrush. So for those of you who may not be familiar with wood thrush, it's a common migratory songbird in the eastern deciduous forests. winters primarily in Central America and Mexico. If you're not familiar with wood thrush, I just want to clarify that this picture is not to scale. They're not quite this big. But for the past half century or so, wood thrush have been declining at a rate of close to 2% per year. So in that way, they're quite similar to most other migratory species in these habitats. And for a number of reasons, probably not least of which is that for many people, the song of the wood thrush is kind of the iconic sound of these forests. It's been the subject of quite a bit of research on what might be causing its declines. And that's good because we have a lot of information. It's also challenging because we're using different data sets and different techniques and sometimes get slightly different results. So sometimes bringing all that research together can be challenging. But the work on wood thrush and what's driving declines actually goes back quite a ways. Some of the early work to try to really understand demographically what's limiting wood thrush was done by Roland Roth and his students and colleagues going back to the 70s. They monitored breeding wood thrush on this 15-hectare forest fragment near the campus of University of Delaware. The graphs here show change in the number of wood thrush on this plot from 1974 to 1990, males on the top graph, females on the bottom. And this 1993 paper that they published really focused on this kind of middle period of the study, where there's this sustained decline of wood thrush on the plot. The rate of this decline was largely in line with regional rates of decline. And so this paper was trying to understand which demographic processes seem to be driving this observed decline. And to make a long story short, one of the things that they found in this paper is that the change in returning adult birds, so these open circles here are essentially the number of birds that bred on this plot in previous years that returned to breed in subsequent years, that in both males and females, that was declining pretty much at exactly the same rate as the overall population size. And then right at the end of this study period, that number of returning birds increased, and that was mirrored in the overall abundance. And during this same time period, they had basically no change in recruitment of young into the population or of sort of a naive estimate of immigration into the population. Those rates remained relatively stable. So the conclusion of this paper was that the number of returning adults, return rates of adults was what really drove dynamics in this fragment. Interestingly, during that same period, this plot experienced a very high level of nest failure due to mammalian predators. So you can see this graph is percentage of nest failures. There was this increase in that rate during the time period. And so the overall conclusion of this paper was that these high nest failure rates led adult wood thrush to emigrate from the plot, to disperse to new plots, and that was what was really limiting the local population size. Now, interestingly enough, many years later, I was involved in some work along with my colleagues at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center to try to understand what was driving wood thrush dynamics in another set of small forest fragments, this time in southern Illinois. And we had a very large demographic data set, nest monitoring data, capture, recapture, telemetry work. This is the full analysis was a full annual cycle model, very similar to the model that Adam and Mo just presented for Baird Sparrow. I'm going to focus just on kind of the breeding season, part of this for the moment. So we were able to build this integrated population model and look at which vital rates were most important for driving year-to-year variation in population growth in these 12 plots. So this is a figure from that paper looking at the four big vital rates that we measured: fecundity, immigration, juvenile survival, and adult survival, and the contribution of each of those vital rates to variation in population growth in the 12 plots. So here the y-axis are those 12 plots arranged by increasing habitat quality. I can explain, if there are questions, how we measured habitat quality. So as you go up the y-axis, we're looking at higher and higher quality patches for wood thrush. And one of the things that's quite interesting is that for these low quality patches, we found, quite similarly to the Roth analysis, that adult survival, and I should say this is adult apparent survival, so it includes both true survival and emigration, that was the vital rate that was most strongly contributing to year-to-year variation in population growth. And like the Delaware work, our basic conclusion is that what we're picking up here, the signal that we're picking up, is immigration. So these low quality plots have high nest failure rates and very high rates of immigration by adults after reproductive failure. So that result is quite in line with what they found in Delaware. In contrast, in the high quality plots, we found that fecundity and juvenile survival were the vital rates that most drove population dynamics. So this is essentially telling us that recruitment is most important in those high quality plots. And I won't show it in this talk, but we were able to parse out recruitment into different survival components and found that juvenile survival during spring migration was the vital rate that was most important for driving recruitment from year to year. So suggesting perhaps a role for non-breeding season effects in these high quality patches. So these two studies, it's encouraging that they found relatively similar results, but they are in these very small fragmented breeding patches. And oftentimes we need to learn about limitation at larger scales to guide conservation and management. Fortunately, we have a lot of tools to do that, many of which have been highlighted really well by the speakers so far in this symposium. So Callie gave a great talk yesterday on migratory connectivity of wood thrush. So we have good information from geolocators and from stable isotope data linking breeding populations to specific winter regions, which is really critical for understanding limitation across the annual cycle. We also have really spectacular remote sensing data sets that we can use now to quantify things like change in habitat, amount, and quality, changes to climate parameters over long time periods and across the annual cycle. So we can combine these different pieces of information along with long-term monitoring data from the Breeding Bird Survey to look at how these different processes might be influencing population dynamics. And there's, of course, many different ways that we can do that. And I want to highlight just a couple of studies. So one way to do that are using these migratory network models. So this is work by Kaz Taylor and Bridget Stutchberry, who built one of these migratory network models for wood thrush. So the diagram here shows the network that they built, at least for the year 2000. The circles here are the 4 breeding regions that they used. The size of the circle is in proportion to relative abundance. The squares are the 3 non-breeding regions that they used. And then the edges here, these gray lines, are the connectivity between regions. So this is a model of how wood thrush are distributed across the annual cycle. And then you can include things like habitat scenarios to look at how abundance changes within that network. So in this paper, Kaz looked at a few different habitat loss scenarios. So kind of business as usual, where habitat is lost at current rates, a scenario where we just stop winter habitat loss altogether, and a scenario where we stop breeding habitat loss altogether. So that little inset figure here shows the sort of projected change in wood thrush abundance under those 3 scenarios. And you can see that in this scenario where we stop all winter habitat loss, we see a much bigger change in the rate of decline than when we stop breeding habitat loss. So this kind of leads to the conclusion that wood thrush are primarily limited by the availability of winter habitat. Though I think the conclusions are a bit more subtle than that. You can see that this effect is mainly driven by this big increase in wood thrush abundance in the Northeast when we stop winter habitat loss. But in some of the other regions, we actually see a much bigger effect of stopping breeding habitat loss. So in the central and southeast regions, particularly in the central region, stopping breeding habitat loss had a much bigger effect on projected wood thrush trends. And that was sort of played out in some other scenarios that Kaz looked at, where we parse out where the habitat loss is occurring. So within specific winter regions, and again, we see changing the amount of habitat loss on the wintering grounds doesn't really have a big effect in that central region. If we look at habitat loss within each of those breeding regions, again, we see in the central region and the southeast that stopping breeding habitat loss actually has a really big effect on stopping the declines of wood thrush. So I think this paper points to the complexity of limitation, and that, as has been brought up in a number of talks, it oftentimes doesn't make sense to think of limitation at the species level. It's really at the population level, and some populations are probably winter limited and some are probably breeding limited. Those conclusions are relatively similar to an analysis that I did when I was at the Smithsonian, where we divided up the wood thrush breeding range into much smaller population units. This came up a bit yesterday. I can talk more about it. So basically, each of these units sort of differs in the rate of population decline. There's 17 population units in this analysis. And then we used habitat loss data within each of those regions, within 5 winter regions, along with connectivity information to build this hierarchical model, very similar to the model used by the Breeding Bird Survey to estimate population trends, but with these habitat and also climate covariates to see how much variation in abundance from one year to the next was explained by habitat loss on the breeding grounds and the wintering grounds, as well as climate. One of the things that we found in this analysis was that for some of the populations, particularly these areas that are kind of within the real core of the wood thrush breeding range, that there was this really strong correlation between loss of habitat on the non-breeding grounds and then the abundance of wood thrush that show up the following year. So this, again, sort of suggests that some of these populations may be primarily limited by the availability of winter habitat. But then we did sort of a quick, I'll call it quick analysis of just simply the relationship between the rate of population decline observed in these 17 populations and the total net amount of breeding habitat loss over this about 15-year period. And one of the things we found is that the breeding populations that have been declining the fastest on average tend to be the ones that have lost the most breeding habitat. Now, of course, there's a lot of unexplained variation in this figure, and modeling this as a linear relationship may not be the best way to do it, but this is at least suggestive that in some of these populations, particularly the ones that have lost a lot of breeding habitat, those areas may be breeding limited. So again, this I think is more or less in line with a lot of what Kaz found, in that some of the populations may be winter limited, some of them may be breeding limited. So to just kind of sum up very quickly what we can say from the studies that have been done, at small scales, we found a lot of consistency that high quality patches appear to be primarily limited by recruitment of young into the population, and that in turn seems to be largely driven by survival during the non-breeding period, whereas low quality patches seem to be primarily limited by emigration of adults after reproductive failure. At large scales, we see a slightly different picture where perhaps these kind of core high abundance populations are limited by the availability of winter habitat, but populations that have lost a lot of breeding habitat may be currently at least summer limited. Now, most of these analyses, at least the large scale analyses, don't tell us a lot about the demographic mechanisms. So the retrospective analysis that we used, as well as the network models, don't tell us as much as we might like to know about the role of survival versus fecundity, particularly seasonal survival. So that's something that I think is still an outstanding question, at least at the scale that we oftentimes need to answer these questions. But I think we have a lot of potential to address these using many of the tools that have been discussed earlier. So Jim talked this morning about the role of MAPS and MOSI. Wood thrush is relatively well sampled by those programs. We have just phenomenal products coming out of the eBird program that allow us to build integrated population models. So I think there's a lot of room to build kind of large scale, spatially explicit, full annual cycle models to get more at these kind of demographic mechanisms that might be limiting populations and how that varies across the range of a species. And like I mentioned, this work was done by a lot of people. So I'll just end by acknowledging all the folks that contributed to this, particularly Pete Mara, Brant Ryder, Jeff Hostetler, Scott Sillett, Jonathan Valenti, and Callie Stanley, who were really instrumental to all of the wood thrush work that was done at the Smithsonian. And with that, if there's time, I can take questions or just hold that until the end.
Yeah, fantastic job, Clark. I really like this, the way you told the story. It was really interesting to see the evolution of thinking about wood thrush along that timeline and through those different studies. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of time to ask questions now, so we'll definitely hold those and for the panel discussion at the end of the session. So I want to move on to a species that I've worked on, and Amber Roth, who's currently a professor of forest wildlife management in the School of Forest Resources and the Department of Wildlife Fisheries and Conservation Biology. They lumped them all together at the University of Maine. We'll be presenting. Ruth Bennett is a co-author on this study of golden wing warblers, and I should say that Amber is also chair of the Golden Wing Warbler Working Group and has been for a long time, and is the coordinator of the Midwest Migration Network as well. Gosh, you're pretty busy there, Amber. So enlighten us on the Golden Wing Warbler.
Thank you for that introduction. And I want to acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Ruth Bennett at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, who contributed to this presentation and will be available for questions if folks have questions, especially about her research that's included in this presentation. When Tom first asked me to give this presentation, he asked if I could tell the story of everything we know about golden wing warblers and then also present a new project, and I felt like there's no way I can do that in 15 minutes. So I'll do the best I can to kind of tell a story of what we know about golden wing warblers. I'm going to leave out a lot of details, so please ask questions if there's something you want to know that I gloss over. And we're building in this presentation up to where we're headed with an integrated population model as well as some spatial modeling. We're nowhere near the point where the last two presentations are at. We're right at the very beginning. So I am very much interested in your input as we start this process. So first, let's start off with a little background on golden wing warbler. If I will advance, there we go. The range of the golden wing warbler, they breed in two regional populations, one in the Great Lakes, one in the Appalachian Mountains. They spend their winter in Central America as well as Northwest South America. One of the fun things about golden wing warblers, some people might call it challenging, but I think it's really interesting, is golden wing warbler has a sister species, the blue-winged warbler, with which it hybridizes. This is a phenomenon that's been known for a long time. And the outcome of that hybridization is the Brewster's warbler, Lawrence's warbler, and a bunch of other variants in terms of phenotypes. And it begs the question of whether we should manage golden wing warbler as a single species or whether we should be managing the genus as a complex, especially given the fact that we've lost the third member of the genus, which is the Bachman's warbler, which is thought to be extinct. So what does this look like in terms of genetic introgression? This information comes from the Golden Wing Warbler Genetic Atlas, which was led by Rachel Vallender back in the 2000s. This map shows a number of study sites that were sampled. The numbers in the pie chart indicate the number of individual golden-winged warblers that were sampled, and the pie chart indicates the proportion of those phenotypic golden wings that have blue-winged warbler introgression in them. And you can see that there is higher introgression in the east versus the northwest, which has implications for conservation and management. And I will also note that we have no genoscape for the species, and I do have a pile of feathers if Kristen's listening. So that might be another next step for this project, is to understand that aspect of different populations from that perspective. We know a lot about golden-winged warbler connectivity. The bird in the middle has a light level geolocator on it. It's this technology from which we know most of the migratory connectivity information for the species. We have very little from band returns. The graphic on the left that's playing is a single golden-winged warbler that was tagged in Vermont and is en route to spending winter in Colombia. You'll see the hotspot there. The map on the right was presented yesterday by Ellie Knight, showing Gunnar Kramer's assessment of geolocator data, showing the strong kind of structure that exists between the Great Lakes population and Central America and the Appalachian population and South America. So we have pretty strong segregation between those regions. Ruth Bennett provided a little more insight into the migration aspect of golden-winged warblers by still looking at geolocator data. And I should mention that this is based entirely on males in the population. And what she found in her research is that there are two different migratory strategies that are happening within the same population, but for different individuals, and that a large number of individuals are staging for spring migration in northern Central America before they cross the Gulf of Mexico into the southern United States. And that there's a smaller group of individuals that spend very little time in stopover in northern Central America and immediately cross over the Gulf into the southern US. And so there's these different migratory strategies. And as a consequence of that, those that made the crossing very quickly had a shorter migration duration and arrived on average 8 days earlier on the breeding grounds. I'm going to really gloss over habitat associations. We know a lot about habitat. Generally speaking, golden-winged warblers nest in young deciduous tree-dominated forests. We know that for foraging and their post-fledging habitat is a little broader, including some other forest types and a little bit older forests. On the wintering grounds, they use pretty humid mid-elevation forest and cloud forest, as well as semi-dry forests like pine oak forest and lowland semi-deciduous forests. The thing they have in common is that they seem to key in on disturbance of different scales. On the wintering grounds, it tends to be smaller gaps that form in the forest versus on the breeding grounds, where they can use stand replacing disturbance areas in the forest, like in the picture shown here. So disturbance is a very important element. Another project that Ruth Bennett led is really insightful into what might be causing some limitations in this population. She looked at sexual segregation on the wintering grounds. You can see this map on the left from Central America. The blue areas are where females have high occupancy. The yellow to brown areas are where there's high male occupancy. You can see that they're spatially separated from one another and associated with different land cover types. The polygons, the black polygons on the map indicate the focal areas that have been proposed in the conservation plan. And what we've learned is that these focal areas are very male biased, and that if we were to move forward with conserving habitat for females, we probably want to increase the focal areas that we have in those blue areas. The other interesting thing is that these different areas are experiencing different levels of forest loss. Females are in areas or forests that have higher rates of forest loss than males, which may also indicate some parts of the problem and where there may be a limiting factor for this species. But we really need to look at that more closely demographically. Another interesting piece of this story is when the males and females arrive on the wintering grounds. You have males on the left, females on the right, and the week in which they're arriving for two different forest types. We have evergreen forest, which is thought to be higher quality forest, and semi-deciduous forest, which is lower quality. And the males are very quickly occupying the evergreen forest, and initially the females are as well. However, as more males arrive, females are being displaced into the semi-deciduous habitat. So you can see how the occupancy in the evergreen forest declines as arrival progresses. And also, if you look at the male graphic, you will see that there are some males in the semi-deciduous forest. Those tend to be dominated by males of lower body condition. So understanding body condition is really important part of this story in the behavioral interactions between individuals, both male and female. So as we're leading up to understanding what's happening demographically, I just wanted to give a kind of quick checklist of what we know for the species. I don't have enough time to go into all of the information and how it was gathered, but we do know quite a bit about nest survival and fledgling survival and associated habitat characteristics. We know a bit about full nest productivity for some sites, a little bit about juvenile dispersal. We have within season adult survival rates primarily from the wintering grounds. We have a lot of adult return rate information from which we can estimate apparent annual survival. The last three bullets all about adult survival though are very male skewed. We know a lot more about males than we do about females, which is a little bit problematic and a significant gap. So as we're thinking about what we need to know that we don't have currently, we need to know about more about juvenile dispersal. Clearly from Ruth Bennett's research, we need to understand more about adult dispersal and displacement and how frequently that happens. We need to know more about recruitment, within season survival during both stationary and migratory periods, and the differences by age and sex. Certainly, being a naive hatch your bird might mean very different things in terms of survival than it does if you're a mature adult. So we really need to understand those differences by age group. We need to know a lot more about what's happening with adult females in terms of survival. So getting return rates on females at both ends of the migratory cycle are important. Also, again, knowing differences in age groups. We know very little about migratory habitat and those associations. And finally, carryover effects are likely important, especially as we're learning about habitat segregation on the wintering grounds. So I am inspired by some of the new research with MODIS, as well as the banding initiatives and the potential for that to inform some of these vital rates that we're missing. I think the biggest issue is whether these stations are in places where we can acquire enough data to inform vital rates. I know I had a conversation with Steve Albert from IVP about the MAP station program, and we came to the conclusion that we probably need at least 8 more MAP stations in very strategic locations within the breeding habitat of golden-winged warbler in order to improve, even get to a point where we can estimate vital rates. So there are definite limitations of working with declining species that are very habitat restricted. This species is in decline. This is the breeding bird survey data. You can see there's long-term population decline. In the Appalachian Mountain region, the decline has been so severe that the breeding bird survey doesn't even detect the species anymore. It's essentially been zero for quite a few years. So this is problematic in terms of monitoring the species and has prompted use of other methods for tracking populations. As a consequence of some of this, this is a 3X species within the Road to Recovery list. So it's a high priority. And as a consequence of these declines, the species was petitioned for Endangered Species Act protection. It has undergone the 90-day review. It is currently at the 12-month status review point, which should be initiated here in 2021. As a consequence of this, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is very interested in understanding the future trajectory of the species and has funded a new project in order to understand these changes. So this is through collaboration with USGS, the University of Maine, Ashland University, and many collaborators within the Golden Wing Warbler Working Group who provide much of the data that I just mentioned previously. And so our concept is that at the base, we want to create an integrated population model to understand how the population is changing, hopefully also being able to identify some limiting factors or confirming those that we might suspect. But we also want to understand where the species is going to be in the future. What's the spatial representation of where they're headed? So climate change is important. Looking at that, continuing to understand the interaction with blue-winged warbler, thinking about habitat suitability. Not all areas of suitable climate have suitable habitat, so that's a restriction in terms of where they'll be in the future. So all of this is leading to kind of understanding future population size and viability, as well as where the birds are going to be distributed. So these are a lot of big questions, and I'm worried we've bitten off more than we can chew, but I'm very interested in understanding what other people have done. So I love the last couple presentations in particular. Your input is welcome in terms of how we might tackle this new project. We're literally kind of at day one. We'll be starting January 1st, really diving into this project. So we're very much at the beginning and would like to get this right. So, I'll stop there. So
Thanks so much, Amber. That's
Thanks.
great. This is a species that got me launched in my biology career, so I care about this bird. So, but unfortunately, we're out of time again, so we'll defer questions to the panel discussion at the end of the entire session, and we'll move on to our next talk, which is by Mike Hallworth. Mike is a wildlife ecologist whose research sits at the nexus between movement, population, and quantitative ecology, and he's a postdoctoral research associate at the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies. Mike, where is that?
That's in Millbrook, New York. But I'm in Massachusetts right now.
Okay. Mike's going to talk to us about Connecticut warbler, even though he's in Massachusetts right now, and even though Connecticut warblers don't breed in Connecticut. Take it away.
No, they don't. Well, thank you very much for inviting me and having me here. I'm going to talk to you today about try to squeeze as much information out of little bit of data as possible. I'm jealous of the wood thrush and some of the other projects that were going on, the amount of data that are there. And so this is a collaborative effort across basically all of Canada. And so I'm really thankful for all the co-authors here. And we're all here, whoops, sorry. We're all here because species, North American bird avifauna is declining, and there's a urgent conservation action needed to help abate these declines. I'm going to talk to you today about the boreal forest birds, which are not doing as well. And I'm going to dig in. This is from the State of the Birds report here. They broke them into long distance migrants and residents, and that there are more long distance migrants that aren't doing as well. And it appears that the residents are doing a little bit better than the long distance migrants. And then this figure below that I highlighted here, this is from the State of Canada's Birds from 2019. This highlighted line here is the species that winter in South America. So it's kind of setting up that maybe some of the drivers of this decline are happening elsewhere outside of the breeding grounds. But the problem obviously is that for most of these species, we don't know where they're going or the migratory connectivity. So there were some speakers yesterday that set up migratory connectivity really well. And if, in case you weren't there, the migratory connectivity is a geographic link between two or more phases of the annual cycle, and it can range from weak connectivity where populations are mixing throughout the annual cycle to strong connectivity where you have discrete populations wintering together. And the data you need are either marker capture data, tracking data, isotopes, somewhere we can get geographic information about those individuals. One example I'd like to share is some recent work that we published on Prothonotary warbler with the Prothonotary warbler working group, where they tracked individuals from across the breeding distribution, and they found that almost all the individuals winter in Colombia. And this is by definition weak connectivity because they're all lots of individuals from many different populations are mixing during the winter. And so from a conservation perspective, you can think that targeted efforts in Colombia and key stopover locations, which I didn't show you, could have some disproportionate impacts at the population level. And so that gets me thinking about, okay, well, if something happens in a certain part of the range that's important, how can we relate that back for the full annual cycle model to get an idea of what's actually driving some of these declines? And so here today, I'm going to talk about the Connecticut warbler, and I'm going to hopefully integrate breeding, migration data, non-breeding back to population declines. And so we set out to answer this question, is how does habitat loss and the resulting habitat fragmentation throughout the annual cycle contribute to population declines that we're seeing? And we predicted that the areas of the greatest loss will explain population declines, whether it's breeding, migration periods, or the stationary non-breeding season. And then our other prediction was that populations experiencing the greatest habitat loss will show the steepest declines. And so if you don't know much about the Connecticut warbler, that's okay, because we don't know a ton about it. We know that it breeds across the boreal forest in Canada. There are some populations in the northern US that are breeding there. We know very little about the distribution in South America, but we do know that they embark on migration. They cross the Atlantic Ocean. Emily McKinnon a few years ago and colleagues showed that they do cross over the Atlantic, similar to blackpoll warblers. And their populations are not doing well. So they're on the watch list. They're a species that's at most risk of extinction without significant conservation action. And so I'm not going to get really deep into the methods. I'm just going to kind of glaze over some of them. But we delineated natural populations based on breeding bird survey data. Clark, Russian, and colleagues came out with this method a few years ago. He briefly touched on it a little bit earlier today. But we delineated the natural populations using BBS data. And we deployed light level tags at 5 locations across the breeding grounds. So from Alberta to Quebec, and to estimate connectivity. And then we derived estimates of habitat loss that was informed by where these birds were going. And I'm going to dive right into some of the results of the natural populations. And we identified 8 natural populations, and the entire population is in steep decline. So the estimated population trend from this analysis is roughly 9% per year. And 3 of these natural populations are declining significantly, i.e. the credible interval does not overlap 0. For the remaining 5 populations, over 90% of the MCMC iterations are suggested there's a negative trend estimate. So there's really strong support that all of these natural populations are declining. And this analysis was from 2000 to 2017. And the reason that we limited that is because that's when some of the forest loss habitat data sets began. We used the light level tags to estimate migratory connectivity throughout the annual cycle. So from breeding to stopover locations, and then from breeding to winter locations. We estimated connectivity using the MIGE connectivity package, which I helped create. And in part of that package, we needed to find these target regions, so regions where these birds could go. And so what I did is I created 500 by 500 kilometer grid cells that kind of span some areas of interest. And the first one was the pre-Atlantic stopover sites, and their stopover there is roughly 10 days. So we're fairly confident in where they were stopping over based on the uncertainty and light level tags. And then the other post-Atlantic, so after they land, after crossing the Atlantic, these are the target locations that we used in that analysis. And then for the non-breeding season in South America, I basically gridded the entirety of South America because we were unsure where those birds could have ended up. And so here are some of the tracking results. Each one of these lines here, the dotted lines, connect individuals. It's not necessarily where those individuals went or the track that they took, but it's connecting individuals for you. And the strength of connectivity we found is stronger between the breeding grounds and the first stopover location. And there's weak connectivity between the breeding grounds and where they winter here in the northern Gran Chaco region of South America, so that all individuals from all of these populations that we tracked are wintering in similar locations. And having stronger connectivity at the first stopover site suggests that they have population-specific migration routes. And so now I'm going to tie this into remote sensing and kind of looking at habitat loss and how habitat loss may be driving some of these declines, trying to squeeze as much data out of this tracking information as we can. And so we used the Hansen et al. Data set. It's the global forest change data set that goes from 2000 to, it's a yearly estimate of when that forest block was lost. It's at 30 meter pixels across the entire globe. It's a fascinating data set. And we extracted habitat loss within 50 kilometers of each breeding bird survey route. We also extracted that same information from each of these target zones. Again, these are 500 by 500 kilometers. And we used both the uncertainty and location estimates from light level tags, but also the uncertainty in the migratory connectivity estimate to weight the forest loss across the annual cycles. And so in that way, we're both incorporating the location uncertainty, but also the uncertainty in the migratory connectivity metric to get an idea of how habitat loss is influencing the species across its range. Now, there are some assumptions and some limitations that we had to make to do this modeling framework. First is that we limited inference to a few distinct stopover regions, i.e. like right before they crossed the Atlantic and right after they crossed the Atlantic, because they stayed in those places for roughly 10 days. So we have an idea that, yes, that's where they were. We assumed that individuals that we were sampling were representative of the entire natural population. And then we also assumed that the locations that we found using the migratory connectivity metric remain the same over the course of the study, in this case from 2000 to 2017. And so here's a figure of the habitat loss. Here's habitat loss as a percentage of the total here on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. Each of these lines represents a natural population. Down here in the map, you can see those. And so there's quite a bit of habitat loss that's occurring throughout the annual cycle. And so we used a full annual cycle model where we put these parameters into a model and used a Bayesian indicator variable, which provides an unbiased estimate of variable importance within our modeling framework. And we fit a model with all the stages simultaneously so that we can evaluate the effect of each. And so what you're looking at here is the variable importance on the y-axis, and each stage is on the x-axis. So the breeding grounds, the pre-Atlantic stop, winter, and then the cumulative effect. Oh, sorry. The cumulative effect here. And so the most important variable, it turns out to be habitat loss during the breeding grounds. And this is the effect size here. So almost all of these natural populations, there's fewer Connecticut warblers where you lose more habitat during the breeding grounds. And so this is a schematic, and I'm really sorry about the color scheme. This took forever to build, and I just didn't have time to rebuild it. But habitat loss kind of leads to habitat fragmentation. What you're looking at on the left is all the breeding bird survey routes, and on the right is the northern Grand Chaco region. And so it's getting fragmented at a really high rate. And so we're looking at a separate model to see how fragmentation might impact these. And there are many different fragmentation indices, which you may be familiar with. A lot of them were correlated with one another. So we took 3 biologically relevant metrics, and those were the largest patch index, which is a numeric value from 0 to 100, and which is basically an area to edge metric, where if it's 0, the largest patch within that landscape is very small, and if it's 100, then basically that entire landscape is a patch. The number of habitat patches within that landscape, it gives you an idea of how many they are, but not how they're configured within the landscape. And then total core area, and that is the summation of all core habitat that is non-edge. And in this case, we used edge as 90 meters or 3 pixels. And we calculated the landscape metrics in the landscape metrics R package. If you're familiar with frag stats, it's essentially, you can do all that in R now. And so some of these results, it turns out that the configuration of habitat loss matters. Here again is a variable importance, and this is the largest patch index. It's really important, or it's more important in the breeding grounds than other phases of the annual cycle when looked at it together. And that the larger your habitat patches in that landscape, you get more Connecticut warblers in all of these natural populations. Surprisingly, total core area was not an important variable in this modeling framework, but the number of habitat patches within the landscape was. But there was mixed results. So in some places, mainly on the eastern populations, the number of habitat patches was negative, but in Alberta population, there was a positive effect of the number of habitat patches on the abundance of Connecticut warbler. And here, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I talked about habitat loss and fragmentation, but not really the causes. And so this Curtis et al. Paper in Science showed that forestry and wildlife or wildfire was the primary driver in the boreal region, followed by conversion of agriculture, and then also peat mining, which is really important for this Connecticut warbler, especially in the eastern parts of its range where it breeds in forested wetlands. In the South America, there's a lot of deforestation, and it's primarily commodity-driven deforestation and shifting agricultural. And then now in previous, this was 2018 paper, and then in the previous couple of years, there's been a lot of wildfire in this region too. So that's important to note. And so hopefully what I've done today is take a species that we don't know a ton about, and we don't have demographics from everywhere like some of these other well-studied species, and provide a framework where we can integrate things like community science, breeding bird survey data, tracking data, and remote sensing to try to squeeze out as much as we can in full annual cycle models, so we can start like climbing this pyramid that Ken showed even with not a ton of data. And I want to thank all the collaborators on this project. It's a huge amount of effort, and the funding sources, and everyone that helped in the field. And I'll just leave you with some really great pictures of the boreal forest as I was catching these Connecticut warblers. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mike. We're kind of at the end of the presentation stage and running into the panel stage. So a lot of the questions I think for everybody can come out hopefully in this session, although we'll try to look for questions that involve everybody. So I'd like to, at this point, encourage all the presenters and panelists to make themselves visible. Thank you. And you know, it's really interesting. So particularly with your talk, Mike, and with all the talks put together, I'm kind of impressed about how much we know rather than how much we don't know. It seems pretty amazing, particularly leaps and bounds of information that have occurred over the last few years in terms of species that we were totally in the dark about for the last decade. So that's encouraging in and of itself. There are so many questions that I'm sure people have, but one, and I can think of a couple, but one opportunity I'd like to offer to those of you who are sort of starting on this journey as researchers on a particular species and maybe up against a big question mark and where to go next, although you all did a great job of outlining what your next steps were. But those of you who may have a big question mark, here you have folks who've traveled further down the road to recovery and may have some answers for you. So I encourage those of you who would to take this opportunity to ask questions of the other panelists who have made some decisions that you're just about to make. If that makes any sense. Hearing none says, I know exactly what I'm going to do next. Amber, if you have a question, you're muted, so people can unmute themselves and participate freely now.
I didn't have a question, but
I saw your lips moving.
There are a couple questions in the Q&A, Tom.
Okay.
Yeah, oh, a lot of sun. A lot of the questions in the Q&A are specific to certain talks, so I can go with one of those to start off. So this is a question for Mike Hallworth. What kind of habitat are Connecticut warblers likely using during on the wintering grounds in the northern Chaco? And wintering grounds seem to be south of the Amazon, is that right?
Well, to answer your first question, I'm not exactly sure, right? Because the light level tags, making those associations is very difficult. And I've never been there or seen one on the wintering grounds. So I'm not sure. Maybe someone else here who's birded that region and seen them there can answer that question. And yes, it appears that they are, at least from the light level tags, wintering a bit south of the Amazon, and some of these, the migratory connectivity metric kind of includes the uncertainty and bias in that estimate. So I'm fairly confident that that's where they're actually wintering.
There's another question.
Can I just jump in for a second there, just to illustrate for a bird like Connecticut warbler, because I've been compiling information data on actual winter specimens, historic winter records for all the various migrants. And the Connecticut warbler is the species with the fewest actual documented records. The number of December, January, February records of Connecticut warbler with specimens or photographs in the entire world is 3. And they are from that, right in that area where your geolocator, centroid is, which is really interesting, in that sort of southwestern Brazil, Bolivian border region, but virtually unknown into winter. So that's in itself kind of a limiting factor and a barrier for us is, we really have no idea where they go or what habitats they're using.
Another question, Anna?
Yeah, there's another question for Mike, actually, also about Connecticut warbler. In northern Minnesota, where Connecticut warblers are significantly declining, the outline of their current breeding population is nearly identical to the outlines of the area in Minnesota that will be most significantly impacted by climate change, i.e. where temperatures will rise the most. So what are your thoughts about climate change's role as a driver of declines?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but that we could build similar models with more data that puts climate into a similar model like this. And I would suspect if there's a big climate change signature on the habitat in the breeding grounds that the Connecticut warbler will likely follow suit, at least based on some of these data that I presented. The breeding grounds seem to be really important for their declines.
Thanks. So we have a question for Mo and Adam. What types of conservation scenarios for Baird sparrow are you hoping to evaluate with your IPM?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we actually haven't totally pulled together the scenarios that are the next step. So I think we'll kind of return to that similar base of stakeholders that we use to crowdsource those covariates to come up with a couple different scenarios that are actually realistic and then project from there.
Yeah, and I think we talked about some different climate scenarios as well as, you know, maybe it's not even realistic, but like if we did this much CRP or shrub removal on the wintering grounds or whatever, it may be, how could that influence the population? And then at least maybe give you some idea of how implementing those management actions might change the population, even if they're not completely realistic. They can point you in the right direction.
Grant, you had a question?
Yeah, question for kind of multiple panelists. I guess I'm wondering how the panelists feel about extrapolating fine scale or regional scale demographic vital rate data to estimate changes in abundance across larger geographic areas. And I know the Baird sparrow, one of the solutions is to subset the data. And I guess I'm wondering if another solution that might be worth discussing is thinking about larger geographic data sets like MAPS and MOSI, and how might those be used to correct finer scale estimates that we get from these smaller scale studies. And I wonder if you guys could address that. I know multiple people on the panel have thought about this, so I could point to specific people, but I'll let you guys chime in.
You better point, Grant.
Clark, I'm going to pick on you just because I know you the best.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always challenging to scale up. I mean, I think when we're taking just, you know, one or two small scale studies and assuming that that's representative of a larger area, that's potentially problematic, because a lot of times those locations that were chosen to do the small scale sampling, it's not like we randomly chose that point to do the study. I mean, we probably picked it because it's good habitat or because there's a lot of individuals there. So I think that's problematic. What is probably makes more sense, and you know, this is something, I don't know if Jim can jump in if he's able to do that or not, but you know, if we can, within a region, if there's multiple fine scale, you know, smaller scale studies, to combine those in kind of a hierarchical framework where we assume that there's some, you know, kind of regional vital rate that applies in each of those smaller scale studies, is sampling, you know, around that overall effect. That's doesn't get around the issue of sort of bias and where we choose to do those studies, but you know, something like MAPS, that those stations were not picked for like one specific species because it was really good habitat for that species. The ability to sort of scale up and make inferences at larger scales would probably be more robust in that case.
But Clark, if you have really good connectivity information and you have a good idea of where some of these populations are, and you have a large population that's in steep decline, and you know that's a quote unquote somehow bound either by genetics or a natural population of some sort, you know, doesn't that say focus on that population? And then in that case, those smaller scale vital rates are really critical.
Yeah, I think it still just comes down to where we're actually collecting those data from. I mean, you know, for a species like wood thrush, we saw in, you know, these 12 study plots, if you had just picked one or two of those study plots and estimated survival, you would have gotten very different survival rates than if you had picked two or three different ones, because at that fine scale, habitat quality is so different between those smaller patches. And so whether or not any of those, a subset of any of those plots is representative of, you know, Southern Illinois or you know, the Midwest for for wood thrush is going to depend on how representative those patches are of kind of the larger landscape that wood thrush are experiencing in that region.
Anna, do you have another question?
We have a question that's a little bit broader, but yeah, I'll ask it. So this is for everyone. The examples presented in these afternoon sessions are all large multi-jurisdiction, multi-collaborator projects. What role can ornithologists who are not part of large research groups or labs play? For example, ornithologists at education institutions, nature centers, small non-research focused organizations, etc.
Good question.
I have some input there. So I think we had a really good experience in trying to create that list of covariates that we ended up including in our model. And that was crowdsourced from, 3 different countries. A bunch of different types of people attended those webinars. We held them in Spanish and English to make them as accessible as possible. And so we had a range of people attending those things from, we had several private ranch owners in Mexico call into our Spanish language webinar. And we also had government employee representation on those, of course, as well. And so I think, if you're not heading up a giant research program that's spreading across 3 countries, hopefully you can get involved to the point where your voice is heard when those kind of decisions are being made. So I really value the input we got from those webinars, and I think that's one way you can contribute.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this one. I think yesterday we touched on this a little bit about how important the human component is in conservation. And, for a center like that, they could sponsor a Mosey station. That's one way they could contribute. They can also talk about, different conservation needs that are out there. They could work with landowners, in the area for various species. I mean, there's so many different ways that small individual groups or even individuals can contribute that I think just the last 2 days, we've touched on a lot of options that people have for getting involved. You don't have to be doing these big range-wide studies to be a part of it. You can be part of one of these stations, or you could put up a MODIS station at your center, and that would go a long ways to helping the whole group of us, right? So I think there's so many ways that people could be involved.
Yeah, Amber, I think that's a good point with the MODIS stations. There's so many ways that people can support, even if you have a small amount of funds to help purchase a MODIS station, or even just contribute support once the MODIS station's deployed there. Like we talked about it yesterday, but that's one of the main issues in keeping these things running, is because we don't know about ongoing costs and ongoing support for that. So I think that's a really good point.
And I think, this still requires kind of coordination from some of these larger partnerships, but for a lot of the species that are, not well sampled by current monitoring programs like BVS, or maybe there's kind of gaps in eBird records and that sort of thing. I think there's good examples of kind of community-based science to get people out to go do counts, to fill in some of those gaps. We're doing this right now with rosy finches, which are really poorly sampled by most of these monitoring programs, but we're finding that we can recruit hundreds and hundreds of people who want to contribute to this, to go out and count rosy finches in places where we need those data. And so I think that's still kind of, the onus is still on the research community to organize those types of efforts, but it's a good way to get some of those people involved who want to contribute to science and can help fill some of the gaps that we have.
And just to add to that, a lot of these large range-wide studies that we've been running with things like common nighthawk that Ellie talked about yesterday, like the wood thrush, like the Connecticut warbler, and several others that you haven't heard about, are actually collections of many, many different ornithologists, many of which are at small schools or at research centers or at nature centers, that are actually just part of this big coordinated project, that are each contributing data, whether it's banding data or it's they're capturing and applying tags under our direction if they don't know how to do it. But these are all collaborations of lots of ornithologists. And our hope is, and we'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow, that we're going to create many more of these opportunities into the future. And that's why we're trying to activate and motivate folks here, so we can do this exact thing, whether it's MODIS towers, or it's actually applying tags to figure out connectivity or whatever it happens to be.
It could be as simple as submitting eBird checklists. Even that's such a valuable data set. There's so many ways that even one individual could contribute to the whole.
I also think, at least in grasslands, and I know in other habitats too, like we can do all of this fancy modeling about what's driving change in populations, but then actually making change happen on the ground is this totally different ball of wax that we then have to tackle. And so individuals are the key to that, especially in grasslands, which is almost completely privately owned, whether you're talking about Canada or the US or Mexico. Those one-on-one relationships can make a huge difference as to how someone knows even about, for example, CRP enrollment, or in Mexico, I'm talking to ranch managers about shrubs and shrub encroachment. Arvind Punjabi, who works with us at Bird Conservancy, has done an amazing job in making those one-on-one relationships with landowners in Mexico, and it's making a difference. And so I think, that's sometimes what a lot of this regional scale stuff, and people who are organizing regional scale things, they don't always have time to do that. And so that is another really unique and important contribution.
Well, that's a really great segue into one of the other questions in the Q&A, which is to everyone. Can anyone speak to how their modeling results are being used to enact conservation measures to recover their study species? And that's a really good example, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I don't know if Arvind is here and wants to talk more about the sustainable grazing network that he's set up in Mexico, but I think that is a great example of it's basically an organization of ranch owners and ranch managers that have agreed to follow management plans that they co-develop along with I'm not sure if it's Bird Conservancy or IMC, so I think I would need him to weigh in on that. But basically, it's moving towards sustainable management of the landscape to benefit both cattle production and ranch longevity, and also birds. But that really comes down to maintaining one-on-one relationships with people and hearing their stories and seeing, how you can work together to move forward.
There are good examples, Rose, from shorebird work, where once you identify these specific locations, then there's quite a lot of pinpointing of on-the-ground conservation action, right?
I don't know if I'm just blanking out, but I can't think of those off the top of my head. But implementation is certainly the next step for most of these things, and is always some of the most difficult things to take our research questions and put them back into the ground. There are certainly efforts to do that for species, but I can't think of them this minute.
Yeah, I was thinking from maybe yesterday, the other shorebird talks where they're talking about harvest and some threats at specific sites, and certainly at the Chilean site where you all work, there's a lot of on-the-ground work happening because of the importance of that area.
Somewhat along the same lines, so tremendous amount of work has been done with golden wing warbler in terms of implementation. I mean, huge projects across mostly across the, well, from Pennsylvania across the Great Lakes states, in terms of trying to figure, in terms of increasing breeding habitat. So, and yet the group is still sort of working on the demographic model, trying to figure out where the limiting factors are and so on and so forth. What's the feedback loop, or how do you feel about all that breeding habitat work? And then also those target areas that have been identified in Mesoamerica and South America. What, how do you feel about that, Amber? Are we on track with that work? Is that work?
Right. I was thinking about that too. You've pointed to a perfect example of where conservation implementation is based on imperfect information, right? So we're putting resources, a lot of resources, into breeding habitat management, especially in the Appalachian Mountain region. And the question is that the best use of our limited resources? And that's why we need an adaptive management framework in what we're doing, because as we get new information, we need to be willing to be flexible and to shift our resources as we learn more. And as with golden wing warbler, as we're starting to learn more about what's happening on the wintering grounds, and I'm becoming suspicious that the problem might be more there than on the breeding grounds, that I think that we need to think about how can we shift resources. And it's not always easy. It's not easy to convince NRCS that they need to spend money in Central America. It's not, within the structure of a lot of these agencies. And so I think this is a really difficult challenge, but I think, you also don't want to wait until you know everything before doing anything. So this whole idea of adaptive management, I think, is really important for most of these species, because we don't have time to wait for some of them to start making some efforts, right?
I want to put a plug in for tomorrow afternoon for the first hour of the afternoon session, where we'll be bringing on several people to talk about the implementation phase and how we're doing this at different levels. So be sure to tune into that. And then there'll be an hour of discussion after that.
What are maybe among this group or in other groups, what are our good examples of effective adaptive management where we're actually taking significant action on the ground, but also sort of learning by what we're doing and thinking about, improvements to our understanding of the dynamics of a particular species? Where is adaptive management at this scale alive and doing well?
Probably waterfowl, since that's where it mostly started, right? So that's kind of the poster child of it. Allowing for harvest, but making sure that we still have ducks for future harvests. So that's the first one that comes to my mind, at least. So.
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit this morning. I mean, that kind of system is working and is alive and well in the game bird world with waterfowl. And, we heard about woodcock this morning, and that, we're so worried about just even collecting some of the details of the data, but to replicate those systems with these declining non-game birds, I mean, it's challenging at all levels. And to, who's going to do that adaptive management even, or we all sort of have to do that collectively, because there isn't really a single agency like there is with waterfowl that wants to know all those answers. So it's really kind of up to us as a group to figure out that machinery for the adaptive management and for learning.
Are there any other great questions from the?
Yeah, there's a kind of specific question from Ellie Knight for both Mike and Clark. Have you considered what you would do differently in your range-wide analyses if you had higher resolution tracking data for each individual, say like for nighthawks? Would you still quantify habitat loss at the regional scale?
Mike, you want to go?
I think so. This is a cop-out answer, but I think it's species specific, right? And it depends what the threats are for your species of interest. And I would love to have some of the detailed information that you have for the nighthawks to estimate connectivity, like you showed yesterday, throughout the, almost daily, and tying those type of metrics in a way. It's easier when there's so much uncertainty, because I could just say, this 500 by 500 kilometer grid and not have to make any really fine scale decisions. And so, but yeah. That's my comment.
I do think having higher resolution information about connectivity would help a lot. I think, in the wood thrush example, we sort of broadly knew, okay, birds from the Northeast aren't going to Mexico, birds from the Midwest aren't going to Panama. But within that, we just sort of said, okay, birds can go to any one of these regions, and we'll let the coefficients that are coming out of the model tell us about whether or not that region is important for driving the dynamics of that breeding population. But, like any ecological data, these are really noisy data, and the ability to pull any kind of signal out of them that's going to tell you about limitation is, the more we can reduce all the noise, the better inference we're going to be able to make about limitation. And some of that noise is probably just coming from putting a bunch of non-relevant information from the non-breeding grounds into the model because of the way we're dividing up these non-breeding regions, the way we're linking populations together. And so I think if we had better resolution connectivity data, we could sort of narrow in it's not that we wouldn't use a regional approach, it's that we would just have much better defined regions that we could use to sort of link habitat loss back to dynamics that we see on the breeding grounds.
Yeah, I would also point out that having those fine scale data allows you to use, there are more data sets that you could actually pull from, like in MoveBank, for example. I'm going to put a plug here for MoveBank. There's the environmental data that you could assign if it's like spatially or temporally fine resolution. You can use their function to get really like fine scale data, like Clark was saying, to help refine some of these parameter estimates. So.
And I think if there's better remote sensing products that do a better job of quantifying like what the actual habitat that species is using, that would help a lot too. I mean, we're sort of we use that Hansen forest cover data set too, and that's just forest cover. You know, it's not, there's a lot of different types of forest, quality forests that these species are responding to, and we're like glossing over all of that. We're just taking, you know, broadly speaking, how much forest cover is in that region. And so I think to the degree that we have remote sense data that does a better job of characterizing like what actually is wood thrush habitat and how is that changing, we would get much stronger inferences from that as well.
So I think the important message here is that if we have connectivity data, then we can do this retrospective analysis prior to getting other detailed vital rate data to get a lot of other insight into where and when limitation might be happening. And I think that's something that we could, and we can build on that with other layers of data, like both of you said. So that might be the first approach to sort of tackling some of these species-specific problems or questions, if we have the connectivity data.
I would agree with that. And to kind of go back to the point about adaptive management, you know, I think there's a lot of talk about integrated population models, and, you know, those are great. We can do some amazing things with integrated population models and make really good mechanistic inferences. But, you know, as we've seen in several talks throughout this symposium, those are hard models to fit. They take a lot of data. There's computational problems. You know, I'm sure Adam and Mo can talk about how hard it is just to get a model like that to fit and to work. And so I think, you know, Pete's comment about, you know, what can we learn from just good count data and good connectivity data and covariates that tell us about, you know, habitat and climate and those sorts of things. Can those at least get us, you know, further down, or maybe I should say further up the pyramid for some of these species in terms of what might be limiting? And then if that's sort of done through an adaptive management framework where, you know, we're sort of, that's getting us a little closer to understanding what's limited, and then that can help target maybe some of the more data intensive approaches that we would need to sort of further refine our understanding of kind of demographically what's happening in those populations.
Yeah, even, you know, to take a step even farther back, I mean, some of the basic data for a lot of these widespread species, just even understanding where in their range they are declining, even if you don't, so that could help target, you know, the samples that you want to use to establish that connectivity. But we don't even really have a fine level sense. I think tomorrow, one of the talks tomorrow, I think Adam Smith is going to address some of the data integration methods that can get at these finer spatial resolutions of even just looking at the population change data and some of the newest trend results coming out of eBird, where you're getting essentially a pixel-based population change estimate at very fine scales. I think this is the kind of information, sort of in an iterative sense, to give us a you know, where to target the populations that are doing the worst, and then target those for the tracking studies to see where they're connected. So kind of starting from that base rather than the broad threat space and stepping that down.
Any more questions, Donna?
Yeah, there's a question that just came up. Do banding stations collect observational data on presence of fault bars, and could that be informative about annual variations in habitat quality?
I'm sure that some banding stations probably do quantify fault bars, and there are some that also measure growth bars that are in feathers. We've used them, and I know lots of other studies have, Tom's Grubb started that stuff in Ohio, looking at growth bars. But I've never seen them be all that useful for these sorts of questions that we're looking at, but I could have missed something.
I have a question for the panel that's related a little bit to something Amber was saying earlier about funding for habitat conservation in Central America. And all of the species that were talked about in this session are migrants that winter in Central or South America. And so, yeah, I'm just curious what all of your thoughts are on sort of how to encourage more funding from federal organizations, from private foundations for habitat conservation on the non-breeding grounds, because it seems like, at least in some of these cases, some of the studies are pointing to the importance of habitat loss on the non-breeding grounds as at least part of the problem.
Well, there are mechanisms for doing that. And I think what we're seeing is that they're just, proportionally, they're just grossly underfunded compared with some of the programs that are aimed at breeding season. And, these have been mentioned a little bit, the Southern Wings program for the states. I mean, the mechanism is there, but it's being used at just a very low level. And so I think it's up to all of us to try to encourage expansion of these programs. There were some comments in the chat from Guy Fawkes, who runs the NMBCA program. And I know that that's one of the things that, at the largest level, at the policy level, people have been trying to boost the levels of funding for programs like that can fund. They're designed to fund conservation work south of the US, but they're just funded at such a small level compared with these domestic programs. That's really one of the big issues.
Yeah, I actually think that points to the importance of doing these demographic models, because a lot of the funding these days is headed in the direction of business plans. And a lot of investors want to see what's the population effect of an investment of X number of dollars. And one of the best ways to be able to answer that is if you understand the relationship between different populations and demographics and habitat and that kind of thing. So I think the direction that we've headed in terms of conservation funding is that the investors want to really see what the return is going to be for every dollar they put into it. And so I think that's on us to try to figure out how to kind of demonstrate that.
That was one of our goals with the IPM, was to see how much, well, essentially take management action, like let's say in Mexico versus CRP or something like that, or grazing practices in the Northern Great Plains, how much they cost and the change in Barrett's sparrow populations in response to that. And then you can quantify, per dollar you're getting this many birds, and where is it most effective to spend your money. That might also require hiring an economist, though.
There's a follow-up question about this from Sarah Kendrick. In response to Ken's comment, how can we use our collective voices as federal agencies, powerful NGOs, the top minds in the ornithological community with a unified voice to increase those funding sources at the federal level? Or is that even a possibility? And I think we'll probably get into that a little bit more tomorrow.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a great question, Sarah. And in fact, Sarah is going to be moderating the panel tomorrow afternoon. And so, Sarah, you're not supposed to cheat, but she'll be talking about some of this stuff tomorrow. We'll be going into a lot of these questions in the afternoon.
And just for everybody's knowledge, the chat is now open to attendee chats and to chats around the board. So please talk as much as you want in the chat.
Yeah, and if you're able to see the chat, there are people who've been chiming in on some of these questions that, you know, maybe we in the panel have not done a very good job answering, and there's some good answers actually in the chat. So we're gonna, I think as Tom said, we're gonna compile all that information and make it available, but it's also a place where you can scroll back through and see, you know, for example, some of Guy's answers to the Latin American funding question.
And the way Zoom spits out the chat and the Q&A is a little arcane, and will take us a little bit of time to put that into a form that's digestible, but we will do that. However, the recordings for all these sessions, the recordings for yesterday are already posted on the web for the website for this R2R2. So you can, if you missed something yesterday, you can go right to the web and watch those recordings. And today's recordings will probably be posted at the end of the day as well. So all that will be available as a recording, which you can access in the cloud.
So Tom, a question, since, maybe a technical question, since before you opened it up, people were only able to comment to the panelists, and now it's to panelists and attendees. Will everybody be able to see the chat that happened just to the panelists previously?
Yes, as far as I know. There's one, as far as I know, there's one chat.
Somebody's saying they don't see the chat before it opened up. We could figure out a way to deal with that.
Yeah, I think the saved version will have all of it visible to everyone.
We want to encourage people to put questions in the Q&A, right? But again, tomorrow afternoon for an hour at the end, we're going to talk about where this is all going to go in the future, what we're thinking about this, and please save your questions. These are great questions, and let's get into them tomorrow in a lot of depth and an all group discussion.
Yeah, so I am seeing questions in the chat that are directed at all panelists. So people are able to enter
Right,
things.
but now the attendees can't see those apparently.
Well, maybe they can't see the actual questions. I see. Yeah, that'll all be available later. Let me see if I can do that now.
Yeah, so people can tell that we're making it up as we go along here.
I don't seem to have that. The way it's set up, it says allow attendees to view all questions. So
Questions or chat?
in the Q&A and the chat as well.
I think typically the way Zoom works though is anything that happens prior to when it's opened up to other attendees, then they can't see anything prior. That's been my experience with Zoom in other meetings like this. So.
Right. We save the chat starting from the beginning. So we have the chat for the whole, even just the panelists. So when we go through and edit it, we'll be able to post that so everyone can see the questions at another time. I just checked the version from yesterday and it's all good.
Tom, should we wrap it up?
I'm happy.
Yeah, got another great day tomorrow. So
yeah, and I want to thank thank all the attendees. I mean, the attendee numbers until just the last few minutes have vacillated between 250 and 190. So that means the attendees have been in there for the full course meal. And I want to thank especially the panelists and presenters from today for doing such a great job and for providing just a huge amount of information in a very brief period of time. You did a great job sticking to your 15 minutes, especially this afternoon. So thank you all so very much. We'll have some really interesting talks tomorrow morning. So And then tomorrow afternoon will be an opportunity for a little more interaction and question and answers from everybody. So we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Same time, same start time. Again, thanks so much for participating and have a good evening.